When I was a little girl, I lived on a farm with my grandmother Irma, who had this peculiar habit of telling sayings all the time. One of them stuck in my memory forever, and that is that every time something was very old, she would say that it was older than Uncle Fernando's soul. Once, I asked her about a picture that was hanging in the living room, in which there were some green hills and a little yellow house in the middle with colorful flowers. At that moment, my grandmother answered that that picture was older than Uncle Fernando's soul. I thought it was very funny at the time. It was a cute way of saying that something had a lot of history, but as time went by, I began to wonder who this Uncle Fernando really was. So one day, I went to my mother and asked her to tell me about him. She smiled and suggested that I ask my grandmother to tell me the story of Fernando's soul, since she knew it much better. I was only 8 years old, so I loved listening to the stories my grandmother told, and this one, I was especially eager to know. That afternoon, I came out of the kitchen, where my mom was, and ran to my grandmother's room. As soon as I walked in the door, I said, "Grandma, tell me the story of Uncle Fernando's soul." She was a little surprised because I ran in and caught her off guard, but then she smiled and motioned for me to sit next to her. My grandmother began to tell me that Uncle Fernando was really her younger brother. According to her, since he was born, his eyes were open, he was hairy, and he almost never cried. When he was hungry, he moved his arms and mouth a lot, as if he wanted to talk to his mother, but he didn't make a sound. At first, the family thought these things were funny. They saw it as part of his personality, but as he grew older, everyone noticed that Fernando had quite strange behaviors for his age. She remembered one moment in particular, when he was about 4 years old, and she was 9. They were in the living room, and suddenly he was staring out the window, very serious, as if contemplating the sky from there. She remembered that it was raining that day, and while she was trying to decipher what her brother was looking at so much, suddenly Fernando told her that his soul was very different from hers, because he had an old soul. My grandmother was speechless for a moment and then burst out laughing, thinking it was a joke of his, but he looked at her with a seriousness that surprised her and asked her to stop laughing. But she kept on guffawing until she realized that despite her laughter, he was looking at her very seriously. So she stopped and, to her surprise, Fernando smiled at her and told her that her soul was not yet ready to understand what he was saying. A few days later, Fernando told his siblings what he had been saying, and they all began to move away from him, as it was somewhat strange and uncomfortable for them to hear such a little boy talk that way. But my grandmother felt a special affection for Fernando, so she decided to overlook the comments of the others and began to take what the boy was saying seriously. One night, while they were at dinner, he approached his mother and with tears in his eyes, told her that he wanted to go home. She, obviously confused, replied that they were already home, but the boy kept insisting, mentioning that he wanted to go back to a different house, even though she wasn't there. As they were already used to Fernando's weird talks, his mother decided to ask him more about that house he had in mind, so he started to describe it. He said it had 2 floors and 3 rooms with wooden frames on the windows, that the walls were made of red brick and were covered with small green branches. He also mentioned that the roof was made of wood, that there were roses at the entrance that perfumed the house when you entered, and when it rained a lot, the water leaked through the kitchen ceiling. His mom was shocked to hear his detailed description, because they had never been to such a place. She tried to explain to her son that she couldn't know that house because they had always lived in that old farmhouse where they were now. But at that moment, Fernando told her that they hadn't lived in this time, that he had been there before everything flooded and the earth opened up to bring him back. That left her even more confused. She didn't understand what her son was talking about, and in the end she just smiled, patted him on the head a couple of times and told him he had a great imagination. My grandmother said that she was fascinated by Fernando's description of the house, but the rest of his siblings were frightened every time he mentioned that place again. When Fernando was almost 7 years old, my grandmother saw something in the newspaper that caught her attention. His dad bought it on Sundays because they didn't have TV on the farm, and on one of the pages there was a note about a ghost town, a place near the sea that had been flooded many years ago. It said that no one had lived there for more than 30 years, and that they were just rebuilding the houses to turn it into a tourist destination. The report was extensive and had several photos of the houses that made up the town before the flood that wiped it out. But as she looked at the pictures, my grandmother was struck by one of them. It was a house that matched exactly what her brother had described: brick walls, wooden roof, roses at the entrance, and vines climbing up the walls. If it wasn't the same, it looked too similar to the house Fernando was talking about, so she ran to find it to show him. But when he saw the photo, he told her he wasn't quite sure. He didn't seem to remember anything he had told years before, although he was impressed that his sister remembered his description perfectly. She insisted to his parents that they had to go check that place out, because she believed that, although he no longer remembered it clearly, he had lived another life before, and for some strange reason, had memories of that past existence. Of course, to his parents that sounded crazy. My grandmother said that her dad had never punished her as hard as he did that day, and never did it again. Her father was a man of deep Christian faith, and it sounded like blasphemy to her what he was talking about. After that, my grandmother and Fernando decided that they would not talk about those topics in front of the family anymore. And the truth is that it was not a big problem, because as they grew up, their older siblings moved away, some to the city and others to start their own families. So, as my grandmother and Fernando were the youngest, they were the last ones to leave home, and with time, he seemed to have forgotten everything he used to tell when he was a child. Fernando was always a quiet person. He liked to spend time alone among nature, and sometimes he would go into the bush at night and not return until the next day. He would say that he slept wherever the night caught him, and he was always kind to everyone who knew him. My grandmother clearly remembered the stories he told her as a child, so she always reminded him that he was an old soul. When she had her first child, she was quick to say that some things were older than Fernando's soul, and that quickly became one of her signature sayings. However, I never knew Uncle Fernando, so I asked my grandmother what had become of him, and with a sad air she told me that once, when my mother was still a little girl, he told her that they had to say goodbye. She didn't quite understand what was going on, but he insisted that he had to leave and that he couldn't come back, even though he knew they would meet again in a different place. From that day on, she never saw her brother again, as he went back into the mountains and never came out again. My grandmother always told my mother about him, and later, when I was born, she shared the whole story with me. The truth is that I didn't think much about Uncle Fernando until a few years ago, when my grandmother got sick. There are those who say that when older people are about to leave this world, their spirit begins to leave little by little. It is as if they feel they have to say goodbye, and they begin to see things that we cannot. And that was the case with my grandmother. 3 years ago, her health deteriorated, and she started spending more time in bed. At that stage, she began to say that her time here was coming to an end. We were very sad to hear her say it, but there was something in her tone that conveyed a kind of calmness that was almost comforting. One night, I was having trouble sleeping, as I felt my throat was dry, so I decided to get up and go to the kitchen to get a glass of water, but I didn't turn on the light because I didn't want to disturb anyone. While I was in the kitchen, I thought I heard my grandmother's voice, so I slowly approached her room, where she always left the door a little open. I peeked in and saw that she was looking at a chair next to her bed, smiling. She seemed to be talking to someone, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. It was just whispers. I strained to get a better look with the light coming through the window, and I could honestly swear there was something or someone in that chair. It wasn't a shadow. It was like a violet-colored silhouette that was emitting some sort of light and seemed to float. At that moment, I felt short of breath. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then the lamp suddenly turned on, and the silhouette disappeared. Suddenly, I turned to look at my grandmother. She had turned on the light she had on the bedside table. Then she called me, asking if I had been there for a long time. I didn't know what to say to her at that moment, but I realized she had tears in her eyes, so I told her what I saw, and she smiled, saying that her brother had come to visit her. It was the second time in a few days that he had visited her. I asked her which brother she was talking about, even though I already knew the answer. She didn't say anything else, but she looked calm, almost happy. She told me that Fernando was waiting for her, and that soon it would be time to meet him again. That night I cried with my grandmother, because I knew what her words meant, so I slept with her and hugged her very tightly to prevent her from going anywhere. But at dawn, she was already gone. I woke up still hugging her fragile body, but soon I realized that her soul was no longer there. She had gone with Uncle Fernando. Hello, my name is Raul, and the truth is that I don't know who else to tell what happened to me, because nobody seems to believe me. My family says it was just a weird dream that I'm obsessed with, but I don't think that's so. It all started years ago when I was a kid and my parents bought a beautiful farm outside of Lexington, Kentucky. The farm was really beautiful, had a very cozy atmosphere, and was surrounded by huge green fields where I knew I could play all the time. I was very excited to be there. My 3 siblings and I were looking forward to spending our summer vacation there, and we were not disappointed. You could enjoy nature without any problems, and if you got bored, there was internet and the phones and electricity were always working. It was like having the best of 2 worlds, the convenience of the city and the beauty and tranquility of the countryside. In addition, we made friends quickly with the local kids. The days, they were pure joy, and we spent hours exploring every corner of the house and playing in the pastures, but little by little I began to notice strange things. They were small details that the adults didn't seem to see, but that my curious childish eyes did pick up on. Once, I was with some other kids from a nearby farm playing airfield hockey in the basement of the house, which my parents had converted into a playroom, when suddenly, we started hearing voices. They were like whispers, like people talking very softly. At first we thought it was my brothers playing a joke on us, so we decided to ignore them so they would get bored. But no matter how much we pretended nothing was happening, these whispers continued, until at one point it got so creepy that we decided to leave the basement and go play frisbee in the backyard. Again, it was raining and I couldn't go outside, so I was putting together a dinosaur model when suddenly someone started knocking on my bedroom door in a very insistent manner. Thinking it was my parents or one of my siblings, I told them they could come in, but they kept knocking. That happened 3 times before. Tired, I got up and went to open the door. I remember that I saw the shadow of feet on the other side, but when I opened the door, there was no one there, nor in the hallway. That was already too weird, but then something even scarier happened. My model flew out by itself and crashed into the wall right next to my head. That time I got so scared that I ran out to find my parents, but although they comforted me and listened to my story, they told me that it was just my imagination and that the house was a safe and cozy place. But I felt that there was something else there, something hidden in the shadows waiting patiently to attack me. I could feel it. Another time, I remember my brothers and I had spent hours building what we called the perfect fortress. It turns out that we used all the couch cushions in the living room and the blankets in our bedrooms to build an impenetrable war fort, according to us. And it looked really impressive, so we decided that we were going to sleep there that night. We wanted to make popcorn and ice cream in the kitchen, to watch movies until we fell asleep. And since I was the youngest, it was my turn to carry the stuff from the kitchen to the fort. But just as I was about to open the blanket to get in, I heard a weird whisper that I couldn't understand, and it was coming from inside the fort. I was sure it couldn't be any of my brothers because I had just seen them in the kitchen, and there was only one way out, so I would have seen them leave. So, I set the 2 bowls of popcorn down on the couch and called out to my brothers, but all I got was more creepy whispers. I started to think that maybe one of them had left the tablet on and was playing some horror video or something, so I felt a little silly for freaking out, so I opened the blanket with a little more confidence. But I don't know how to explain it. Inside it was so dark it was like a cave. You know, forts are a little dark, but if the light is on, the blankets can't completely block it out. But in this case, for some reason I didn't understand, it was like that, like something in there was swallowing the light. Also, it was strangely cold, much colder than the outside. So there he was, standing in front of a fort that was as dark as a cave and just as cold. Nothing could be seen, as if it were a black hole. I was about to yell to my brothers to come see that, but before I could, the fort fell apart out of nowhere, as if a bomb had exploded inside. The couches and blankets flew everywhere. The popcorn made a mess, and the TV shook so much I thought it was going to fall over too. I was in complete shock, shaking with fear, and completely bewildered. My siblings were extremely angry with me, thinking I had done that just to be annoying, but obviously I had not. However, although I tried to explain to them what had happened in 1,000 ways, they didn't believe me, and in the end, everything was ruined, and we went to sleep. This kind of thing happened to me every time we went to that farmhouse, but stranger and more frightening to me was that no one else in my family seemed to have anything strange happen to them. It was as if whatever was in that house had become obsessed with me, always trying to bother me and make my life miserable during my summer vacations. Over time, my visits to the farm became less frequent. As I grew older, my responsibilities and life in general meant that I was able to stay away from that place so disturbing that just remembering it made my hair stand on end. But, as no one had ever believed me, the day came when my parents decided that I had to spend a few days of my vacation there. At first, everything seemed normal, so much so that I began to think that maybe everything I had experienced as a child was just a figment of my imagination. For a moment I thought that my childish mind had exaggerated things, and that maybe nothing strange had really happened in the house. But that tranquility lasted until the first night. We had arrived in the morning and spent a most normal day, riding horses and having fun outdoors. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I felt a strange tension in my room. I looked toward the door and saw that it was open, but I could have sworn I had closed it. The hallway looked darker than usual, and a painting on the wall seemed to be staring at me. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that it was just the trauma of what I had experienced in my childhood. So I settled back on the bed, closed my eyes and tried to relax. But I couldn't shake that restlessness. Suddenly, the sensation of the room starting to get cold hit me as if I were inside a freezer. My skin bristled and a shiver ran down my spine. But then, I felt something icy on my leg, and at that moment I shivered and jumped open my eyes. Everything was very dark, but in the midst of that gloom, I managed to see a diffuse figure that, to my horror, was above me. I couldn't make out its face. It was just a dark shadow, with a human shape that made a wave of terror go into my bones. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My voice was stuck in my throat. I wanted to move, but my body was paralyzed, unable to respond. Suddenly, the figure raised its head and climbed up my body until it was face to face with me, and its cold breath hit my face. Meanwhile, I remained immobile, unable to make any movement. It was as if that being had immobilized me, and no matter how hard I tried to scream or move away, my body did not respond. Then I could feel it moving towards my ear, and that was when I heard a hoarse whisper that will stay in my memory forever. "I will come for you someday." At that moment, the level of panic I was in is something I can't even describe. I will only say that I have never felt such terror in my life. Completely desperate and terrified, I made one last attempt to move or scream, and after a few seconds, I managed to make a small scream. However, it sounded more like a mumble, and my movements were more spasms than anything else. Trembling, I lay in bed with my heart beating so hard, I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. Then I heard what sounded like a faint laugh, and from one moment to the next, the figure disappeared. At that same instant, the room was illuminated again, and the heaviness that until a moment ago had been oppressing my body simply vanished. However, a few minutes passed before I was able to regain control of myself. I can't even explain the level of fear I felt, but my legs were shaking and my breathing was ragged, and as I lay still immobile in bed, trying to process what had just happened, I was overcome with a myriad of questions. Who was this terrifying figure that had managed to break my dream and make such a threat to me? Why did it choose me? What did it want from me? That night I could not sleep. I sat in the living room and stayed there until dawn, praying to the heavens that this thing would not return. The next day, I told my parents that I no longer wanted to be on the farm, and although I tried to explain to them what had happened, they told me that I was too old to make up those stories, so I didn't insist. They would never understand. I just made up a college job that I had to finish in the city, and that same day I went back, spending the rest of my vacation in our house in the city. Since then, I decided I would never go back to that place from hell, and to this day, I have not. But this year, they took one of my nephews to the farm for the vacations, and they had to return earlier than stipulated because the boy kept talking about a shadow man who followed him everywhere. My parents and siblings say it's my fault, that I must have told the little boy things, but I've never had a conversation beyond a greeting or a game with him. Besides, he's 4 years old. I would never scare him with something like that. But I don't think my family will ever believe me. Honestly, I don't care to know what that thing is or why she was so obsessed with me. And now my nephew, I would just want someone to believe me. That would make me feel a little less alone, but unfortunately, that kind of support I won't have in my family, so I'm just left to keep walking away from that damn farm. My name is Claudia, and I definitely have to share what happened on that little farm. To this day, that memory haunts me, and maybe sharing it with someone else can help me get over it a little bit. So this is my story. One summer, I decided to escape to that small town where my grandparents had settled to enjoy their final years. They bought a small house in a rather nice old farmhouse, and it was only 100 yards from the road. The place had a very large plot of land, where they had installed an organic vegetable garden. The house was away from the others, and the perfect place to disconnect from the chaos of the city. When I arrived, I started to explore the house, which was more like a cabin. It had a very cozy kitchen with an exit to the outside, a living room with a fireplace that looked like something out of a movie, ideal for cold nights, and the bathroom was spacious with a bathtub and everything. There was also a room that had been converted into a library and the master bedroom and 2 guest rooms that had the basics. I told my grandparents that they had made an excellent purchase and they were delighted. They told me they felt right at home. It turns out they had good luck with the purchase, as the previous owner was a guy of about 45 who was moving to Spain for an important job and had to sell the property in a hurry, so he let them have it all at an unrepayable price. At first it sounded strange to me and I asked them if the cabin had debts or something weird, but my grandfather, who is always cautious when it comes to doing business, already suspected as much, and so he made sure everything was in order with the notary. In the end, it seemed that he really was just a guy who needed to move out right away. Friday night I was dead tired after the trip, so after dinner with the grandparents I went to the bathroom and prepared the bathtub for a nice hot shower. After a few minutes, I soaked in it and closed my eyes to enjoy the moment. I felt wonderful. Everything was quiet and peaceful, the perfect climate to relax, until I felt something strange. The water on one side of my leg moved. I sat up suddenly, thinking that maybe a bottle of shampoo had fallen in or something, but seeing nothing immediately, I suddenly thought of a mouse and almost got something. The water seemed to move as if something was going in carefully, but I didn't see anything. I tried not to make a big deal out of it, but I couldn't feel comfortable anymore. That feeling ruined the moment for me, so there my relaxing bath ended. I quickly got out of the tub, took a quick shower, wrapped myself in a robe and went to my room. Then I started to arrange a few things for my luggage while I combed my hair in front of the mirror. Everything was quiet again, and it was a relief to know that I didn't have to do anything for the next few days, so my mind was completely disconnected. But then, something broke that calm. I saw in the mirror how the window curtain inflated as if someone was there. I turned around, terrified, feeling my pulse quicken. That was definitely not what I had imagined. I was sure of what I had seen. There was no one there, and yet the curtain had inflated in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. It didn't move smoothly. It was as if it had decided to separate from the window and stay like that, firm, drawing a silhouette. Slowly I approached the window and checked that it was closed, and then opened it with a creak that confirmed that no one had entered. If they had, I would have heard it for sure, But the weird thing was that there wasn't even a breeze blowing outside, and that gave me the creeps. However, I tried to ignore it all, thinking that it was just the change from the noise of the city to the silence of the countryside. Surely my mind was playing tricks on me. When you spend the day surrounded by traffic and voices, and then find yourself in a place full of silence and peace, your head starts to imagine strange things. I convinced myself of that so I could get on with my night and forget about it. Feeling calmer, I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, closing my eyes and ready to rest. But before I fell asleep, I heard the floor creak. I tried not to make a big deal out of it. I figured that's normal in old houses. However, the second creaking sound made me a little uncomfortable, and the third one sounded even louder, as if it was coming from right next to the bed. At that point, I started to get uneasy. 3 creaks, each one closer than the last. That couldn't be just a random noise from an old house, could it? As uncomfortable as I felt, I thought it wasn't a reason to look, until I felt the bed sink in front of me. At that point, I jumped to my seat and turned on the night lamp. I was terrified, with my heart pounding, and with the terrifying feeling that someone was watching me. My first thought was to look for my grandparents, but I was already 22 years old and I didn't want to give them a hard time for being a scaredy cat. So I tried to convince myself that it was all a dream, only so realistic that I had trouble distinguishing it from real life. I started saying this as a mantra in my head so I wouldn't feel so scared, but it was clear that I was having a hard time believing it. Feeling unable to glue my eyes shut, I decided to go to the kitchen to get a glass of water to calm down. I remember I was wearing a tank top and cotton shorts, which I found comfortable to sleep in. I poured myself a nice glass of ice water, but as I drank, I felt something hot brush my face, and this time I screamed in terror. At the same time, I let go of the glass and it shattered into 1,000 pieces on the floor, scattering shards of glass everywhere. My grandparents appeared instantly, alerted by the scandal, and when my grandfather saw the pieces of glass on the floor, he let out a little laugh, as if he thought that all the fuss was because I had slipped the glass, but what actually happened was that the scare made me drop it. Realizing that I had woken up the grandparents, I was mortified and quickly apologized to them. Making them freak out was just what I didn't want, and now they were awake in the middle of the night too, thanks to my little racket. At that point, my grandmother hugged me and told me it was no problem, that we would clean it up tomorrow and that I just needed to rest. I didn't want to tell them everything that had happened because I had already given them a scare, and they were too old for me to be mortifying them with my paranoia, so I just went back to bed. But this time I left the light on and started reading a book to relax a bit. However, my eyelids began to feel heavy after a few minutes, and I decided to take advantage of my sleepiness, to close my eyes and try to get some sleep, even though the light was still on. The minutes passed, and although I was tired, once I closed the book, I could not fall asleep. Everything became strange when I heard the light switch, and suddenly, everything was in complete darkness. I froze, paralyzed. I had never believed in ghosts, but that night, everything changed. I wanted to run away, but for some reason I preferred to stay still, feeling safer acting as if I were asleep. I started to hear creaking sounds on the wooden floor again, which were coming closer to my bed, and then I felt the mattress sinking. It was a hard blow to me. I opened my eyes carefully and, with a little light, I saw the crushed mattress in front of me, but no one was there. I didn't know what to think. I just closed my eyes again, feeling confused and terrified as tears started to gather in my eyes. Suddenly, I felt an invisible icy hand wipe my face dry and then stroke my hair. It was absolutely terrifying. I was so exposed, so scared, so helpless that I simply didn't feel able to do anything but stand very still and wait for whatever was there to just go away. Suddenly something cold began to run up my leg from under the sheets, slowly creeping up from my knee to my thighs, and this made me so uncomfortable that my legs began to shake. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone sniffing my neck. It was not my imagination. There was someone there. At that moment, I felt that icy hand that was on my legs move up my body until it reached my neck, and that's when the real terror came over me. Whatever was there began to squeeze my neck very tightly, making it hard for me to breathe. I tried to let go, but there was nothing. I could feel those hands squeezing my neck hard and choking me, but I couldn't touch them. I started to shake and kick, trying to get out of bed, but I felt imprisoned between the mattress and those invisible hands that were strangling me. It is the most terrifying and desperate thing I have ever experienced in my life. It was like fighting against nothingness. There was no way to defend myself. At one point, my breathing completely shut down, and I felt like I was about to faint. I couldn't scream, I couldn't defend myself, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was about to die. But just as my strength was about to give out, the thing let go of me. I took the biggest breath of air of my life the moment those hands pulled back from my neck, and as soon as I caught my breath, I started screaming desperately and coughing as I dragged myself to the door to get out of the room. However, before I got there, my grandparents came in and got me in a mess. Crying, screaming, and shaking with fear, my grandmother hugged me and started crying, while my grandfather asked me over and over again what had happened to me, but I couldn't utter a word. I just cried and cried and cried my eyes out. It took me a while to calm down and explain to my grandparents the terrifying experience I had just had. They were horrified, but luckily, they did not dismiss what I told them. On the contrary, at that moment, my grandmother confessed to us that since they moved to the farm, she had also had strange experiences, like hearing footsteps and seeing a shadow through the curtains, but this surpassed anything. That night, I slept with my grandparents, and the next day I returned to town. Soon after, my grandparents sold the farm and bought another property in the country, but in another town several miles away. My grandmother told me that they tried to contact the previous owner, but the guy seemed to have vanished. She was sure that this thing was the reason the man let them have the property at such a low price. Surely he too was tormented by this evil spirit, until he had no choice but to run away. Be that as it may, this was the most terrifying experience I have lived until today, and I hope I will never again experience something similar. Before I end my life tonight, I need to put down in writing the reason that brought me to this point. It is as a way of venting in the midst of the whirlwind of pain and fears that oppresses my chest at this moment. If I have the courage, I'll post it when I'm done. And if you're reading this, it's because it's already happened. And I want you to know that in the end, I'm at peace, because I know I did the right thing. It all started when I moved to my fiance's farm. My favorite animal at this place was a little pig named Bombilla. She was a giant sow who, at first glance, might look a little scary, but she was actually a sweetheart. Bombilla behaved like a puppy every time I approached her, always asking me to scratch her behind her ears and making adorable little noises if I didn't listen to her. In fact, it was she who partly sold me on the idea of living on the farm. At first, I was terrified to move in with Tony and her herd of animals: sheep, goats, chickens, turkeys, pigs, donkeys, and all sorts of other farm animals. Before that, I had only had 2 pets, 2 fish and a turtle, but I was madly in love with him and he with me, so I decided to take the plunge and move to his 45-acre ranch just a few months before our wedding. His dad had raised Tony there, but sadly, he had passed away 2 years before I arrived. After I moved in, at first she kept insisting that I sell that house and move somewhere closer to town, but it only took a few days for Bombilla to show me that the animals on the farm were more than just pets. She was incredibly smart and loving. She was like my friend, and I quickly began to love the rest of the animals as part of my new family as well. When I arrived at the farm, she was pregnant, and a week after Tony and I returned from our honeymoon, she gave birth to 4 adorable piglets. Although I was on the verge of a panic attack during the birth, I managed to be there from start to finish and was proud to see it. The day after the birth, Tony brought the neighbor's children over to name the offspring, as was tradition. The youngest piglet was named Pow, which wasn't very original, but there it was, and after that, everything was going great. The piglets needed a lot of care, but they were incredibly tender. I was convinced that between Bombilla's natural wisdom and Tony's experience, They could help me not to make too many mistakes in their care. But the piglets were only a couple of days old in the world when the whole nightmare started to happen. After finishing the day's chores, Tony and I went to bed happy as all newlyweds, but it wasn't long before a terrifying shriek woke me up. At that moment, I jerked away from Tony and ran to the window, and I really can't describe the horrible despair I felt at that moment. It was frightening. We both ran down the stairs and across the field to the pig pen, but by the time we got there, the screaming had died down, as if someone had turned off a radio and we could only be guided by the moonlight. I couldn't quite see what was going on until I was a few steps away from disaster. God, just remembering it brings tears to my eyes. There was the poor little piggy. His little body was in pieces. It looked as if he had been slammed over and over against the wall. His little legs were dislocated. His body was swollen and bruised. His little nose twitched as if he was trying to breathe, but never did, and his glassy eyes stared at us as we walked through the door. Yet Bombilla stood there, totally uncaring, beside her dying newborn. I couldn't understand it, until at that moment, with an almost automatic movement, she lifted him by the back with her mouth and raised his head in one swift motion. As I realized what she was about to do, I gave a scream and tried to stop her, but Tony stopped me in my tracks, holding me by the arm, while the sow plunged her nose into the ground with brutal force, crushing little Pow. I almost fainted when I heard the poor little piggy's bones crunching against the ground. At that moment I started screaming, completely desperate, and tried to get into the barn, but once again, Tony stopped me. "It's over, Brenda. She's dead," Tony whispered, as tears rolled down my cheeks and my stomach that knotted. He was right. Pow was probably gone the instant she hit the ground. I didn't know how many times Bulb had crashed his son into the ground before we arrived, but I understood why Tony stopped me. If we had intervened, we would have been responsible for his death. The humane thing to do was to let nature take its course, although what was natural about that? Tony also had tears in his eyes as he picked up the other 3 little pigs, who stood terrified in a corner, while Bulb continued to move his limp body, satisfied that Pow was dead. I watched my husband as he carried the piglets into the adjoining pen, trying to keep them away from their mother, and asked me to wait in the house while he buried Pow. I was completely bewildered. I couldn't understand what was going on with Bombilla. She was a sweet and very affectionate little pig. I would never have imagined her capable of doing something as heinous and unnatural as that. I could almost see evil in her eyes as she murdered her baby. If I wasn't aware that it was an animal, I could have sworn she felt satisfaction in doing it. I just couldn't process it. As soon as I got to the room, I threw myself on the bed to cry, and soon after Tony arrived. He was also very upset, but more than that, I noticed him especially restless. He was drenched in sweat and covered in dirt when he came in and sat on the other side of the bed. He was silent for a while, then raised his eyebrows and said to me, "Breda Codrington, there's something I need to tell you." It gave me a shiver to hear him, because it was rare for him to call me by my full name. "What is it?" I whispered, feeling an emptiness in my stomach. "What happened tonight is nothing new. All the animals on the farm kill their young, unless they are separated immediately. I don't know why it happens. There's no scientific explanation to clear it up. It's something that's always happened here." At that point, he averted his gaze, but I walked up to him and asked, "How can that be?" "I don't know. I'm sorry. I know that's not an answer you like, but that's all I can tell you." "Even Lightbulb?" I asked, remembering the nickname I had given my favorite little piggy. "Yes, Brenda, they all do." She sighed, and I knew that sigh meant she was getting ready for the next part. "You're wondering why I didn't separate the babies right away, aren't you?" he said, and I nodded. He sighed again and continued, "The truth is, I was being selfish." I saw him clench his fists, frustrated. "I didn't want to have to tell you this. I wanted to think it was all in my head, you know. Now that Dad's gone and you and I are starting a new life, I thought instead of separating you two, we could just see what happened. Maybe the curse never existed, and I would never have to have this horrible conversation with you. But look what that ended up in." A tear slid down his cheek and fell onto the bed, and my heart squeezed with pain. I knew he was suffering from it too, but what he was telling me was so strange and macabre. How could such a thing be possible? In the days that followed, Tony avoided looking me in the eye. He was so ashamed that he looked like the one to blame for Pau's death. Seeing how much this fact shocked him only made me love him more. I told him 1,000 times, but he didn't believe me. However, that was only the first infanticide I witnessed on his farm. Since then, it has been 4 years and several deaths, especially when the animals give birth at night, when we are not supervising them and did not realize that the mother was in labor. We try to keep the animals separated, but they have to reproduce for the farm to function. I wouldn't want to list all those horrible episodes I saw, because they are clearly not pleasant memories. However, one that haunts me in nightmares is what happened with Dorothy. This was a cat that we would always find her sleeping in different places on the farm. Sometimes we wouldn't see her for days, and Tony and I had talked about how she had put on enough weight to think she was pregnant, and we always tried to keep an eye out for her. But you know how cats are. They come and go as they please. We really started to worry when she disappeared for 2 weeks, during which time she probably gave birth, and I feared for the lives of those helpless kittens. But what could we do? I continued with my daily chores, taking on more responsibilities on the farm since Tony was promoted in his job. He is now a quality specialist for an insurance company, and his new position means he has to travel from time to time for training. One day, mid-morning, when I went to change the water and feed in one of the pens, I saw Dorothy resting on a pile of hay. I called her name excitedly but a little scared. She looked thinner, but I didn't see any kittens, and strangely, that relieved me, because it would have been a big mess to have to rescue them and feel responsible for them until Tony came back. I wasn't ready for that on my own. Truth be told, I'd rather be able to go on thinking she was never pregnant. When I bent down to touch her, the orange ball of fur stretched and blinked happily, but over the din of thirsty goats, I had to get up to give them a drink. The water was in a huge 10-gallon tub in one corner of the pen and had to be changed every 2 or 3 days. But by this time I had gone about 5 days without changing it, and as you might imagine, the water was already looking very cloudy and full of hay, dirt, and all the filth the goats brought in their snouts. As I am a rather short woman, it took me quite a while to lift it up and turn the water over. But suddenly, I heard the sound of the water falling, followed by some hard, wet thumps. I was so startled that I let go of the tub and stared at what was left in front of me. It was then that I stared in horror at the shriveled little bodies of Dorothy's kittens. They were so small that their eyes were still closed. At that moment, I fell to my knees and started to cry. The scariest thing was that they had no wounds, so the only thought that came to my mind was that Dorothy had picked them up one by one and dunked them in the water until they stopped moving. I did not change the water or food that day until night fell. I spent the afternoon trying to locate Tony, who would arrive around dusk. When I managed to contact him, he suggested that I put a towel over the little bodies and that he would take care of everything when he returned. I wish I could say I'm writing this because I'm afraid for another animal's life, but no, it's much worse than that. Shortly after that, I found out I was pregnant, and as expected, Tony and I had a discussion about the whole thing when we found out I was expecting a baby. What if it happens to me? I asked him, almost dreading his response. What if I decide to hurt our baby? When I expressed this to him, Tony stroked my hair, looked at me tenderly and said, "Honey, that's not going to happen. I grew up on this farm, remember? Our baby is going to be fine and grow up healthy and happy." However, inside me I felt a mixture of anger and fear because I couldn't help but think that he was raised alone by his father. His mother, by all accounts, died in childbirth. But looking at everything I had seen, now that I think about it, maybe that was the story he was told to avoid further questions. Tonight I'm alone, and it has been 10 days since I gave birth. During all that time, I hadn't been alone for a moment. Tony and my parents, family and neighbors have been there to support me at all times, which has made it easier to ignore those dark thoughts that assail me, these thoughts of hurting my baby. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was something psychosomatic, that by obsessing over those ideas, I really thought it might happen. But every night since Dylan was born, I lie awake looking on the internet about postpartum depression, searching for some answer that explains how I feel. Sure, if you look hard enough online, you can find justification for whatever it is, but every time I put my phone down and look at the little figure in the crib next to me, all I can think about is how badly I want to hurt him. I can't help but be assaulted by intrusive thoughts, related to grabbing him by the legs and slamming him against the floor repeatedly, like Bulb did to little Pow. This terrifies me, and with each passing day I feel a deep anguish consuming me from the gut. I have not mentioned any of this to Tony because I know that if I told him, not only would I disappoint him greatly, but he would not leave Dylan with me for a second. He would see me as a danger, and I truly fear he would do to me what I am sure his father did to his mother, and he would have to live with that for the rest of his life. I love my son with all my might, and the maternal connection I have with him is almost overwhelming. But I don't know how much longer I can contain this horrible urge that tries to overpower me. Even sleep has become impossible for me. This torment gives me no respite. The nightmares have become more terrifying every day. The night before Tony left, I dreamt that Dylan and I were hiding from a killer. I held him tight to my chest as we ran through a dark cornfield, stopping only to catch my breath and hear the killer moving through the plants, until finally, I made it out of the field and saw a little house in the distance. I ran to it as fast as I could, closed the door and plopped down on the couch with Dylan in my arms until I managed to calm down. Then I placed him on the table in front of me. Then I took off his pajamas. But what I did next is an image that haunts me every second. I started to remove his skin. He didn't make a sound. He just looked at me with an intense gaze while I ripped off pieces of skin, which I was piling on the side, and little by little I was stripping him until only a piece of skin was left between his eyes. We stared at each other for quite a while, and then his little eyes sank into his skull. At that moment, I woke up. I jumped out of bed with my heart racing. I staggered quickly to the bathroom and vomited repeatedly, and before Tony could ask me what was wrong, I told him that the food had made me sick. I took a shower that lasted an hour and a half, until my heart stopped beating like crazy. Tonight I was alone with my son. A few hours ago I went upstairs to change his diapers and feed him, then came downstairs, had a glass of milk and decided to watch TV for a while to try to distract myself from the dark thoughts that have already started to creep up on me. The last thing I remember after that is feeling myself fading, not enough to fall asleep. But about 20 minutes ago I woke up, and I had no idea how, but I had made it halfway down the stairs with a knife in my hand. When I realized, I screamed in terror and threw it as far as I could before collapsing right there, crying in despair and anguish. I can't take it anymore. I have no control over myself anymore. God, I don't even know who I am. I can hear Dylan crying right now. He's been screeching for food for a while now, and I haven't fed him since this afternoon because I'm afraid of what I'll do before I can stop myself. And if I call Tony, my mom, a neighbor, or the police, I know that the instant I hang up the phone, maybe I'll kill Dylan before anyone arrives. I'm freaking out, and there's nothing I can do to control it anymore. I need to protect my son from me, or from this thing that is eating me up inside. Writing this is the only thing holding me back from hurting my own baby right now. I'm shaking so hard right now, I know I don't have much time before I can't take it anymore. Ever since these thoughts came up, I've been using every fragment of my mind to find a way to prevent it, and tonight I finally found a way to save Dylan from me. I can't risk having another episode like the one on the stairs, and this writing has been a form of procrastination. I know. Tony, I love you. Dylan, I love you. Please don't ever forget. I have only one last request before I give it all up. That you burn this farm to the ground until there is nothing left but dust and ashes, and run away. Run as far away from here as possible and never come back.